black orphan girl was forced to marry a disabled Korean mafia boss. What she found out changed everything. The private chapel overlooking the Han River was silent except for the whisper of silk against marble. Lila Abayomi stood frozen as a stranger's hand. Strong, calloused, covered in scars she couldn't yet read. Slid a platinum wedding band onto her trembling finger. She didn't dare look up. Not yet. Not while her heart was still hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. When she finally raised her eyes, she found Park Tae-in watching her with the intensity of a man who had memorized every exit in the room. He sat motionless in his custom wheelchair, dressed entirely in black, his posture rigid and controlled. His face was handsome in a sharp, unforgiving way. High cheekbones, a jaw that could cut glass, and eyes so dark they swallowed light. A tailored blanket covered his legs. His expression revealed absolutely nothing. To the world, this marriage was a business transaction between powerful families. To the debt collectors who had handed her over like collateral, it was the day they finally closed a file. But to Lila, standing in a borrowed white dress with no guests, no music, and no way out, it was the moment her life stopped being her own. The officiant's voice echoed off the marble walls. "You may now exchange vows." Tae-in leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. "You are safe here," he said. 3 words. Quiet. Absolute. Lila wanted to believe him. She wanted to laugh. She wanted to run. Instead, she nodded. Because what else could a girl with nowhere to go possibly do? But the real revelation didn't come until that first night. The master suite they led her to was larger than any home she'd ever known. Floor-to-ceiling windows, silk curtains that pooled like water on polished floors, furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. The staff bowed when she passed. Chefs asked about her preferences. When she tried to clean up after dinner, a maid gently took the cloth from her hands, looking almost frightened. "This is not your role, ma'am," the woman whispered. Lila sat on the edge of the massive bed, still wearing her wedding dress, waiting for instructions. Orders. Conditions. Some revelation of what she was actually here for. None came. Instead, she heard the mechanical whisper of a wheelchair in the hallway. The door opened. Tae-in rolled inside, his movements precise and controlled. He stopped a respectful distance away, his hands folded in his lap. "I know you're afraid," he said quietly. "You should be. But not of me." Lila's throat tightened. Then who? For the first time, something almost human flickered across his face. Something that looked like understanding, maybe even grief. "Everyone who put you in that chair across from those lawyers," he replied. "Everyone who made you believe you were a debt to be paid." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I know what it is to be reduced to a rumor, to be dismissed because of what people see instead of what you are." The weight in his voice made her chest ache. "You're not a prisoner here, Lila," Tae-in continued. "You're my wife. And in this house, no one will ever make you feel small again." She wanted to argue, to question, to demand proof. But the certainty in his eyes stopped her cold. "Hello, family. How are you doing today? Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you're new here, please subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of strength, secrets, and second chances. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Now, let's continue with Lila's story. The truth about how Lila ended up in that chapel didn't start with a wedding. It started with death. The hospital corridors smelled like antiseptic and grief, a scent Lila would never forget. She was 19 years old, standing outside a room where machines had finally stopped beeping, and a doctor was telling her that her uncle was gone. Sudden stroke. Nothing anyone could have done. She nodded mechanically, her hands clutching a duffel bag that contained everything she owned. "Do you have other family?" the nurse asked gently. Lila shook her head. What she didn't say, she had never really had family to begin with. Her uncle had taken her in after her parents died. But taken in was generous. She'd been a maid in all but name, cooking, cleaning, staying out of sight. The small bedroom she'd slept in for 6 years wasn't hers. The house wasn't hers. Nothing had ever been hers. The sealed envelope the hospital gave her confirmed it. Letters to creditors, liens on the property, debts that stretched back years, all tied to her uncle's gambling and bad investments. By the end of that week, the locks on the house were changed. By the end of the month, Lila was sitting in a lawyer's office, staring at 3 men in dark suits who spoke about her future like she was a misplaced piece of property they needed to relocate. That was the first time she heard the name Park Tae-in. A Korean syndicate financier, the lead lawyer said, sliding a folder across the polished table. His voice was clinical, detached, the tone of a man discussing stock portfolios, not human lives. He's willing to absorb your uncle's outstanding obligations in exchange for certain considerations. Lila's hands were folded in her lap, nails digging into her palms. Considerations. The second lawyer, younger, unable to meet her eyes, cleared his throat. A marriage arrangement, purely contractual. You'd be provided for, protected. The word protected tasted like ash. She wanted to laugh, to scream, to flip the table and walk out. But where would she go? Back to a house that no longer had her name on anything? To streets she had no money to navigate? She was 19, alone, and drowning in debts she didn't create. He needs a wife with no complications, the lead lawyer continued. No family ties, no media presence. Someone who understands discretion. Someone disposable, Lila thought bitterly. Someone who won't be missed. The path to that lawyer's office had been paved with years of invisibility. Lila had learned early that silence kept you safe. After her parents died when she was 13, a car accident no one ever fully explained, her uncle had taken her in with the enthusiasm of a man accepting a bill he couldn't afford. She wasn't family. She was obligation. So she made herself useful. She cooked his meals, cleaned his messes, and asked for nothing. She attended school but never brought friends home. She existed in the margins of his life, a ghost who folded laundry and stayed quiet during his drunken rages about money he didn't have. When he collapsed in the kitchen that Tuesday morning, Lila had called the ambulance with shaking hands and ridden with him to the hospital. She'd sat in that fluorescent-lit waiting room for 6 hours, clutching her backpack, praying to a god she'd stopped believing in. The doctor had emerged with sympathetic eyes. "I'm sorry. We did everything we could." Lila nodded. She didn't cry. There was a strange numbness to it. Grief mixed with something she hated to name. Relief, maybe, or just exhaustion. The envelope came later, sealed, official, addressed to creditors with her uncle's name scrawled in shaky handwriting across the top. Inside was the truth he owed everyone. Loan sharks, casino operators, private lenders who didn't operate within legal boundaries. And somehow, impossibly, Lila's name had been woven into the fabric of his failures. Guarantees signed when she was a minor. Forged documents she'd never seen. These debts, the lawyer had explained during that first meeting, aren't just financial, they're consequential. The people your uncle borrowed from don't accept bankruptcy. They accept payment. "I don't have money," Lila whispered. "No," he agreed, "but you have value in other ways." 2 weeks. That's all the time they gave her to prepare for a life she never chose. She packed everything she owned into one battered suitcase. Clothes that had seen better years, a photo of her parents she kept hidden in a book, the cheap necklace her mother had given her before the accident. It all fit. Her entire existence condensed into 20 pounds of fabric and fading memories. The morning of the flight, a black car arrived. The driver didn't speak, didn't look at her, just loaded her suitcase into the trunk like she was cargo being shipped overseas. Lila stared out the window as her neighborhood disappeared. The cracked sidewalks, the corner store where she used to buy bread, the park where she'd once believed her life might become something beautiful. She'd signed nothing, said yes to nothing, but her silence had been recorded as consent. At the private terminal, a woman in a crisp blazer handed her a passport she'd never applied for and a boarding pass with her name already printed. "Mr. Park's representatives will meet you in Seoul," the woman said. Do you have any questions? Lila had 1,000 questions. None of them mattered. She climbed the stairs into the private jet. Plush leather seats, gleaming surfaces, luxury she'd only seen in magazines, and felt the door seal behind her with a final, terrible click. The engine hummed to life. The plane began to taxi. Through the oval window, Lila watched the ground fall away, the city shrinking into a grid of lights and shadows. Somewhere below, there was a version of her life that had been possible once. A version where she finished school, found work, built something that belonged to her. That version was gone now. As the clouds swallowed the plane whole, Lila pressed her forehead against the cold glass and finally let herself understand. She wasn't being rescued. She was being delivered, and the man waiting for her on the other side. Park Tae-in, the stranger in the wheelchair, the syndicate boss whose name made lawyers drop their voices. He wasn't her salvation. He was her consequence. The estate emerged from the Seoul hills like something out of a fever dream. Sleek lines of steel and glass rising against ancient stone walls. Modern architecture wrapped around traditional Korean elements. The car rolled through gates that opened without a sound, past gardens manicured with surgical precision. Lila's stomach twisted tighter with every meter they traveled up the winding drive. When the vehicle finally stopped, a line of staff stood waiting at the entrance. 10 people, maybe 12, all dressed in crisp uniforms, hands folded, eyes lowered. The driver opened her door. Lila stepped out on unsteady legs, clutching her worn suitcase like a shield. And then they bowed, all of them, in perfect unison. Deep, respectful bows that held for 3 full seconds. "Welcome home, Mrs. Park," the head housekeeper said in accented English, rising with a warm smile that somehow made everything worse. Mrs. Park. The name landed like a stone in her chest. "I'm not," Lila started, but the words died in her throat. What was she supposed to say? "I'm not really his wife? I'm just debt repayment?" The housekeeper gestured toward the entrance. "Please come inside. Mr. Park is expecting you." The interior of the house was overwhelming in its quiet perfection. Marble floors gleamed like water. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city below in gold and shadow. Every surface was clean, every corner precise. Art hung on walls that probably cost more than her entire former neighborhood. The air smelled faintly of jasmine and something else, money, maybe. The scent of a world she'd never belonged to. A young staff member reached for her suitcase. Lila pulled it back instinctively. "I can carry it," she said quickly. The woman looked uncertain, then bowed again. "Of course, Mrs. Park. Your suite is on the 3rd floor. Would you like me to show you?" "Suite. Not room. Suite." Lila followed her up a floating staircase that seemed to defy gravity, down a hallway lined with doors she couldn't imagine opening. When they reached hers, the staff member stepped aside. The space beyond was larger than the entire 1st floor of her uncle's house. A king-sized bed, a sitting area with furniture that looked like sculptures, windows overlooking gardens that glowed in the dusk, an ensuite bathroom with a tub big enough to swim in. "Your wardrobe has been prepared," the woman said softly. "Dinner will be served at 7. Is there anything else you need?" Lila shook her head, unable to speak. When the door clicked shut, she stood in the center of the room, suitcase still gripped in white-knuckled hands, and felt something crack inside her chest. This wasn't real. None of this could be real. That first week, Lila tried desperately to make herself useful. Old habits died hard. She woke early, instinctively looking for chores. When she found a coffee cup left on a hallway table, she picked it up to take it to the kitchen. A maid appeared instantly, gently taking it from her hands. "Please, Mrs. Park, we'll handle this. I don't mind. It's not appropriate." The woman's voice was kind but firm, almost frightened. Lila tried again the next day. She attempted to make her own bed, only to have the head housekeeper find her halfway through and look genuinely distressed. "Mrs. Park, this is not your role," she whispered, smoothing the sheets with practiced efficiency. "If Mr. Park knew we allowed you to—" She stopped herself, bowing quickly. "Please, let us serve you." The message was clear. Accepting help wasn't optional. It was expected. And through it all, Park Tae-in watched. He appeared at meals, always precisely on time, rolling into the dining room with the mechanical whisper of his wheelchair. He spoke rarely. A nod to acknowledge her presence, brief instructions to staff delivered in Korean. His voice low and controlled. He never raised it, not once, but the house listened. Lila noticed it during her second dinner, when two staff members in the kitchen began arguing in hushed, rapid Korean. The tension bled into the dining room. Before Lila could process what was happening, Tae-in set down his glass with a soft click. The arguing stopped instantly. He said nothing, didn't turn his head, just continued cutting his food with precise, unhurried movements. 30 seconds later, one of the staff members appeared, bowed deeply to Tae-in, and left the estate entirely. The other returned to work in absolute silence. What happened? Lila asked quietly. Tae-in's eyes met hers. Dark, unreadable, patient. A disagreement about respect, he said simply. It's been resolved. People didn't fear his anger. They feared disappointing him. Lila saw it in how they moved around him. Careful, attentive, desperate to anticipate his needs before he voiced them. She saw it in how they bowed just a fraction deeper when he entered a room. In how phone calls ended abruptly when his wheelchair appeared in doorways. He commanded the house from a seated position, never standing, never raising his voice, never needing to. And slowly, uncomfortably, Lila began to wonder. What kind of man held this much power while everyone believed he couldn't even walk? What was he hiding? And more terrifyingly, why? Lila found the article by accident. She'd been sitting in the estate's library, a two-story room lined with books in Korean, English, and languages she couldn't identify, trying to understand the world she'd been dropped into. Her laptop, old and slow, had finally connected to the estate's Wi-Fi when a news alert popped up. Port strike in Busan ends abruptly after midnight negotiations. The article was brief. It mentioned private logistics consultants and syndicate mediation, but never named names. Still, something about the phrasing made her pause. She searched deeper. Park Tae-in. His name appeared in financial forums, buried in speculation and rumor. Offshore accounts, shell corporations, a network so complex that authorities couldn't map it, let alone prosecute it. He didn't own ports, he controlled the flow through them. Didn't own banks, he moved money between them like water finding cracks. And he did it all while the world believed he couldn't walk. Researching your husband? Lila jumped, slamming the laptop shut. Tae-in sat in the doorway, his wheelchair perfectly still, his expression unreadable as always. She stopped. There was no point lying. Yes. He rolled forward slowly, stopping a respectful distance away. And? What did you learn? That you're either very dangerous or very good at making people think you are. Something flickered in his eyes. Not quite amusement, maybe approval. Both can be true, he said quietly. He didn't elaborate. He never did. But over the following days, Lila began to see the architecture of his power in action. A shipment detained at customs was released within hours of a single phone call Tae-in made in Korean. His tone conversational, almost bored. A business partner who tried to renegotiate terms mid-contract found his accounts frozen by morning. Not by Tae-in's direct action, but by the systematic withdrawal of favors owed across 3 continents. You don't threaten people, Lila observed one evening during dinner. Tae-in looked up from his plate. No. You just wait for them to make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes eventually, he replied. Especially people who think they're smarter than patience. Is that what you are? Patient. He set down his fork with precision. I'm realistic. Power that depends on fear is temporary. People grow numb to threats. They learn to work around anger. He paused, his gaze holding hers. But consequences? Consequences are permanent. And people never forget the cost of underestimating silence. Lila felt something shift in her chest. Not warmth, not trust, but recognition. She'd spent her whole life watching people shout and rage and demand. Her uncle, debt collectors, lawyers, all of them loud, chaotic, desperate. Taein was none of those things. He was the stillness before a storm, the locked door you didn't test twice. The first time she felt protected instead of owned came during an unexpected phone call. Lila was in her suite when she heard raised voices downstairs, unusual in a house that operated on whispers. She crept to the landing and saw a man in an expensive suit arguing with the head of security, demanding to see the girl. "Mrs. Park is not receiving visitors," the security chief said firmly. "I don't care what she calls herself now. She owes." The mechanical whisper of Taein's wheelchair cut through the foyer like a blade. The man went silent immediately. Taein rolled forward, stopping at the top of the entrance steps, looking down at the intruder with an expression so cold it made Lila's skin prickle from 20 feet away. "You're standing in my home," Taein said quietly, "demanding access to my wife. I'm trying to understand how you thought this would end well for you." The man's bravado cracked. "I just need to speak with her about." "No." One word. Final. Absolute. "Mr. Park, please. You have 10 seconds to leave through that door on your own." Taein's hands rested calmly on his armrests. "After that, security will ensure you leave through whichever exit is closest. I don't recommend testing which option is more dignified." The man looked at the security chief, at the 2 additional guards who'd materialized from nowhere, then back at Taein. Whatever he saw in those dark, patient eyes made his decision for him. He left. Taein waited until the door closed, until the car pulled away, until silence returned to the house. Only then did he look up toward the landing where Lila stood frozen. "You don't owe anyone anything," he said simply. "Not anymore." That night, Lila lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She still didn't understand Taein, didn't trust him, not fully, didn't know why he'd agreed to this arrangement or what he actually wanted from her. But she was beginning to understand something else. The wheelchair wasn't his weakness. It was his disguise. And beneath it sat a man who'd learned that the world underestimates quiet things, patient things, things that wait until the exact right moment to show their teeth. Lila pulled the covers tighter, her heart beating steady for the first time in weeks. She wasn't safe yet, but maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore either. The formal dinner was Lila's first introduction to Taein's inner circle. 6 people sat around the long table in the estate's private dining room. Business associates, legal advisors, people whose names Lila had already forgotten. She'd been seated at Taein's right, a position she understood was symbolic even if she didn't fully grasp what it symbolized. The meal was elegant, courses arriving and disappearing with choreographed precision. Conversation flowed in a mixture of English and Korean, topics shifting between markets, shipping routes, and political developments Lila couldn't follow. She stayed quiet, observant, trying to make herself small enough to avoid notice. It didn't work. Madame Seo-yun sat directly across from her. She was in her 50s, impeccably dressed, her hair pulled into a severe bun that matched her expression. She'd been introduced as a senior aide, someone who'd worked with Taein's organization for over a decade. Her eyes had skimmed over Lila during introductions with the warmth of a tax audit. Throughout dinner, Seo-yun spoke mostly in Korean, her tone sharp and efficient. Lila caught fragments, numbers, names, questions directed at Taein that he answered with his usual brevity. Then, during the 4th course, Seo-yun's gaze settled on Lila like a predator spotting wounded prey. She leaned toward the man beside her and spoke in Korean, her voice deliberately loud enough to carry. The words came fast, but Lila had picked up enough from the household staff to understand the shape of them. "You should be grateful. Men like Chairman Park do not marry girls like you without reason." The room went absolutely still. Lila's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Her pulse hammered in her ears, but she kept her expression neutral, carefully setting the fork down. She'd learned long ago that reacting to cruelty only encouraged it. But she'd also learned to recognize when a room's oxygen had been sucked away. Every eye turned toward Taein. He sat motionless at the head of the table, his hands resting on either side of his plate. He hadn't looked up, hadn't moved, but something in the air had shifted, a pressure change before lightning strikes. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, conversational even. "Madam Seo Yun." She smiled, clearly believing she'd gotten away with it. "Yes, Chairman Park? You are dismissed." The smile faltered.
I'm sorry.
"From this dinner, from this house, from my employment." He still hadn't looked at her. His tone remained perfectly even, as if he were commenting on the weather. Effective immediately. Seo Yun's face went white, then red. "Chairman Park, I was merely—" "You assumed my wife wouldn't understand you," Taein said, finally lifting his gaze to meet hers. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "You were wrong. But even if you'd been right, what you said revealed something far more important than her language skills." He paused, letting the silence stretch unbearably. "It revealed that you fundamentally misunderstand what loyalty means in this organization." Seo Yun opened her mouth, then closed it. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. "Security will escort you out," Taein continued. "Your belongings will be sent to your home address. Our legal team will contact you regarding severance and confidentiality agreements." 2 guards appeared in the doorway as if summoned by thought alone. Seo Yun didn't argue, didn't plead. She stood on shaking legs, bowed, muscle memory overriding humiliation, and allowed herself to be led away. The door closed with a soft click. Taein turned to the remaining guests. "Please continue. The next course should arrive shortly." Conversation resumed in carefully neutral tones. No one looked at Lila. No one acknowledged what had just happened. But the message had been delivered, received, and filed away by everyone at that table. Later that night, Lila found Taein in his study. He sat behind a massive desk, reading documents by lamplight, his wheelchair positioned with characteristic precision. He looked up when she knocked, gesturing for her to enter. "You didn't have to do that," Lila said quietly. "Yes, I did. She's worked for you for 10 years. And in 10 years, she learned nothing about respect." Taein set down his pen, his expression unreadable. "Competence without loyalty is a liability." She proved which one she valued more. Lila stepped closer, her arms wrapped around herself. "What she said, I've heard worse." "I know." His voice softened almost imperceptibly. "That's precisely why it won't happen again. Not here. Not while you carry my name." She stared at him, trying to understand the man beneath the calculated exterior. "You said you know what it's like to be reduced to a rumor," she said carefully. "What did you mean?" For a long moment, Taein said nothing. Then he gestured toward his wheelchair with one hand. "People see this and make assumptions," he said simply. "Weakness, vulnerability, limitation. They build entire strategies around what they think I can't do." His eyes met hers, dark and steady. "They're always wrong." Taein set down his pen with deliberate care. "Because stopping them now would be premature." Lila stared at him. "Premature? They're threatening legal action. They're claiming you coerced me. If they actually file something, they won't." "How do you know that?" "Because filing requires evidence," Taein replied evenly. "And evidence requires documentation they don't want examined too closely." He leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "Let them make noise, Lila. Noise tells me what they're afraid of." "I don't understand." "I know." Something flickered in his eyes. Not quite sympathy, but acknowledgement. "You will." The messages continued. That night, Lila received an email from a lawyer claiming to represent her family interests, the same firm that had handed her the envelope in that sterile office 3 months ago. "Miss Abayomi, we believe you may be under duress. We're prepared to negotiate your safe return and the resolution of all outstanding matters. Please respond within 48 hours to confirm you're able to communicate freely." The subtext was clear: respond, or we'll assume you're being held against your will. Lila showed the email to Taein over breakfast. He read it without reaction, then handed the tablet back. "Don't respond. What if they actually go to the authorities?" Then the authorities will discover some very interesting financial patterns. His tone was conversational, almost bored. Money trails that lead back to fabricated debts, forged documents, frauds spanning multiple jurisdictions. You already know all that? I've known since before you boarded the plane. Taein cut into his food with precision. I don't enter agreements blind, Lila, especially not marriage. She wanted to ask why he'd agreed to marry her if he knew the debts were fake, why he was waiting instead of acting. But something in his expression stopped her. He wanted them to keep pushing. He was waiting for something. By the end of the week, the pressure had become unbearable. A reporter showed up at the estate gates with a camera crew. 2 different law firms sent certified letters demanding meetings. Someone leaked Lila's childhood address, and old classmates started appearing in comment sections, offering testimonials about her difficult circumstances. The world was building a narrative, and Lila was trapped inside it. She stood at her bedroom window one night, watching the city lights blur through frustrated tears, and felt the old familiar helplessness creeping back in. She'd escaped one cage only to find herself in another. Except this time, the man holding the key was sitting in a wheelchair downstairs, calmly reading financial reports, waiting for something only he could see. And Lila had no idea whether she should trust his patience or fear what would happen when it finally ran out. The crash of shattering glass ripped Lila from sleep at 2:47 a.m. She bolted upright, heart hammering, disoriented in the darkness. For a split second, she thought she dreamed it. Then she heard the footsteps. Heavy, multiple, moving fast through the hallway outside her suite. The door burst open. 3 figures in black tactical gear flooded into the room, faces hidden behind masks, weapons gleaming in the dim light from the window. Lila's scream caught in her throat as the closest one lunged toward the bed, blade raised. She scrambled backward, sheets tangling around her legs, pure animal terror blanking out thought. The masked man grabbed her ankle, yanking her toward the edge of the mattress. No, no! She kicked wildly, her heel connecting with something solid, buying her a single desperate second. Her eyes flew to the doorway, to the figure rolling into view with mechanical precision. Taein! She screamed, reaching toward him even as the attacker's grip tightened. Please! And then Park Taein stood up. Not slowly, not with effort or hesitation or pain. He rose like a man shedding a coat he'd worn too long. Fluid, powerful, absolutely certain. The wheelchair rolled backward from the momentum, forgotten, irrelevant. Symbolic death of a lie. Time seemed to fracture. The attacker holding Lila froze for a fatal half-second, his grip slackening in pure shock. Taein closed the distance between them in 3 strides. 3 strides. Faster than she'd ever seen anyone move. His hand shot out, catching the man's wrist mid-swing. The sound of bone breaking was sharp and clean, followed by a scream muffled behind the mask. Taein twisted, using the man's own momentum to drive him face-first into the floor with enough force to crack marble. The second attacker rushed him from the left. Taein pivoted, his body moving with the brutal precision of someone trained to end threats, not manage them. He caught the incoming blade on his forearm, using what looked like a reinforced bracer hidden beneath his sleeve, and drove his elbow into the man's throat. The attacker crumpled, gasping, hands clawing at his crushed windpipe. The third man hesitated. Fatal mistake. Taein turned toward him with the calm focus of a predator who'd already calculated every outcome. When the attacker finally lunged, Taein stepped inside his guard, caught his shoulder, and used his own weight to flip him completely over. The man hit the ground hard, and Taein's knee came down on his chest with enough force to drive the air from his lungs. "Stay down," Taein said quietly. The man stayed down. 15 seconds. The entire fight lasted 15 seconds. Lila sat frozen on the bed, hands pressed against her mouth, watching the stranger wearing her husband's face move through violence like water through cracks. His posture was perfect, balanced, strong. His legs, those legs supposedly damaged beyond repair, carried him with the controlled power of a trained fighter. Everything she'd believed for 3 months shattered like the window behind her. Security flooded into the room moments later, weapons drawn, moving with coordinated efficiency. They secured the unconscious attackers without question, without surprise, as if this was a scenario they drilled for. Because of course they had. Taein finally turned toward Lila, breathing steady, not even winded. His eyes found hers across the wreckage of the room. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She couldn't answer, couldn't move, could barely breathe. He crossed to her slowly, deliberately, giving her time to process. When he reached the bed, he knelt on legs that worked perfectly, so they were eye level. "I was never disabled," he said quietly, each word landing like a stone in still water. "The wheelchair was camouflage." "Camouflage?" Lila's voice cracked. "For 3 months. All this time you were lying?" "Yes." "Why?" Taein's jaw tightened. "Because I needed to know who I could trust, who was loyal to me, and who was loyal to the idea of a weakened leader they could manipulate." He paused, his gaze never leaving hers. "I needed the traitors in my organization to feel safe enough to move against me." "Traitors?" The word felt surreal. "You mean the people who fabricated your uncle's debts, who arranged our marriage to destabilize my position, who believed putting an inexperienced American girl beside a disabled chairman would create an opening." His expression darkened. "They've been planning this for months. The tabloid stories, the lawyers, the pressure, all designed to force you to leave, to make me look weak for not protecting my own wife." Lila's mind reeled. "Tonight was their final move," Taein finished. "They hired contractors to remove you, create a scandal, prove I couldn't even secure my own home." He glanced toward the broken window, his voice dropping. "They were wrong. You let them get this far. I let them show me every card in their hand." He looked back at her, something raw flickering behind his control. "I'm sorry you had to be afraid, but I needed them to commit fully, to leave evidence I could use to dismantle their entire network." Lila stared at him. This man she'd married, this stranger she'd lived with, this lethal weapon wrapped in a performance so complete even she'd believed it. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Someone who knows what it means to be underestimated," Taein said, "and someone who learned that visibility is the fastest way to become a target." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her hand. "I hid in plain sight, Lila, and you, unknowingly, innocently, you were my mirror. You reminded everyone watching what power actually looks like when it doesn't announce itself." Security called from the doorway. Taein stood, fluid, unbroken, terrifying, and gave them quiet instructions in Korean. When he turned back, Lila saw him clearly for the first time. Not a disabled man making the best of limitations, but a king who'd chosen invisibility as a weapon. And she just witnessed the moment he decided to stop hiding. By morning, the war was already over. Lila sat in Taein's study, wrapped in a blanket someone had brought her, watching the news cycle implode in real time. Her hands still trembled occasionally. Adrenaline took hours to fully leave the body, but her mind was clear enough to understand what she was witnessing. Complete and total annihilation. The first headline appeared at 6:47 a.m. International fraud ring exposed in fake debt scheme. Then another. Seoul prosecutors freeze assets in human trafficking investigation. And another. 3 law firms face criminal charges for document forgery. Taein stood at the window. Stood. She was still adjusting to that. His posture relaxed, hands in his pockets, watching the sunrise paint the city gold. He changed into a fresh suit. No sign of the violence from hours before remained except for a barely visible bruise along his jaw. "How long have you been planning this?" Lila asked quietly. "Since the day I agreed to marry you." He turned to face her, his expression calm. The proposal came through intermediaries, lawyers representing what they claimed were legitimate creditors. But the documentation was too clean, too convenient. Someone had spent considerable time building a false narrative. "So you investigated." "I always investigate." He moved to his desk, pulling up files on his computer screen. "Your uncle's debts were fabricated over a 6-month period. Small amounts at first, building to crisis levels right before his death. The loans were issued by shell companies connected to 3 senior members of my own organization. Lila's breath caught. Your own people did this? Former people, Tayin corrected. They believed that if they could install an inexperienced, controllable wife beside a disabled leader, they could slowly shift power while I appeared weak. You were meant to be their opening. But instead you married me anyway. Yes. Why? Tayin was quiet for a long moment. Because the best way to catch a conspiracy is to give it exactly what it wants, and then wait for it to overreach. He gestured to the screen, where documents scrolled past in rapid succession. Every email they sent you, every phone call to the estate, every lawyer's letter demanding meetings, all of it was documented, tracked, traced back to source accounts. His voice remained level, almost clinical. They communicated through encrypted channels they thought were secure. They weren't. When they hired the contractors for last night's attack, they left a financial trail that connects directly to their personal holdings. You knew they'd try to kill me. I knew they'd try to remove you, he said carefully. Whether that meant extraction, coercion, or elimination depended on how desperate they became. That's why security has been monitoring this estate at levels you never saw. Lila thought about the guards who appeared instantly, the staff who always seemed to know where she was, the feeling of being watched she'd attributed to paranoia. I was never actually in danger, she said slowly. You were always protected, Tayin replied. But yes, I needed them to believe you were vulnerable enough to target. Lila stood, the blanket falling away, anger sparking through lingering fear. You used me as bait. No. Tayin's voice sharpened. I used their assumption that you were bait. There's a difference. He crossed to stand in front of her, his gaze steady. Every decision I made prioritized your safety. The suite you stayed in has reinforced walls. The staff assigned to you were all trained security. The wheelchair? He glanced toward where it sat, abandoned in the corner. Kept me close to you during meals, during public appearances, positioned where I could respond to threats in seconds. By pretending you couldn't walk. By making them believe I couldn't stop them. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. People reveal their true intentions when they think they're facing weakness. Lila, I needed to know everyone involved. Every conspirator. Every facilitator. Every person who looked at you and saw an opportunity instead of a human being. Lila's throat tightened. And now they're finished. He pulled up another screen, this one showing live news footage. Arrests at a law firm downtown. Federal agents escorting executives from a shipping company. Prosecutors standing at podiums, announcing charges. Fraud, human trafficking, conspiracy, attempted murder. The debts attributed to your uncle have been proven fabricated, Tayin said. The original creditors, the real ones, have been compensated from the frozen assets of the conspirators. Your name has been cleared in every legal jurisdiction. That fast. I've been preparing the case for months, he replied. I just needed them to commit the final crime. Attempted murder carries significantly more weight than financial fraud. And hiring contractors to breach my home gave me jurisdiction to involve international authorities. Lila sank back into the chair, overwhelmed. You planned all of this. I planned for all of this, Tayin corrected. There's a difference. I created conditions where they'd reveal themselves. They chose how to respond. She looked up at him. This man who'd sat across from her at dinner, who'd defended her against Madame So-Yun, who'd hidden in plain sight while building a case that would destroy his enemies. What happens now? She asked. Now? Tayin's expression shifted, something almost vulnerable breaking through. Now I stop pretending to be someone I'm not. And you decide whether you want to stay married to who I actually am. Lila's heart hammered. Which is? Someone who believes power exists to protect people who can't protect themselves, he said quietly. Someone who learned that strength isn't about being seen, it's about being effective. He paused. And someone who watched you survive being treated as collateral and saw something I'd forgotten I was capable of recognizing. What? Someone worth fighting for. The silence stretched between them, fragile and new. Outside, the city continued its morning rhythm, oblivious to the carefully executed downfall happening in boardrooms and courtrooms across 3 continents. Inside the study, Lila finally understood. She'd never been bait. She'd been the mirror that showed Taeyeon's enemies exactly what they were, and gave him everything he needed to end them. "I'm staying," she said. Taeyeon's shoulders relaxed almost imperceptibly. "Good. But no more lies." "No more lies," he agreed. For the first time since they'd met, he smiled, small, genuine, and absolutely devastating. And Lila realized she'd married a king. Now she just had to learn how to be his queen. 6 months later, Lila Abayomi stood on the cracked sidewalk of her old neighborhood and felt nothing but quiet closure. The street looked smaller than she remembered. The corner store where she used to buy day-old bread had new owners. The park where she'd once imagined a different life was empty except for a few scattered leaves dancing in the autumn wind. Everything had changed, including her. Beside her, Park Taeyeon stood with his hands in the pockets of his tailored coat, his posture relaxed but alert. No wheelchair, no performance, just a man walking next to his wife through a part of her past that no longer had power over her present. "You didn't have to come with me," Lila said quietly. "Yes, I did." His eyes scanned the street with the habitual awareness of someone trained to assess threats. "You shouldn't face ghosts alone. They're not ghosts anymore." She looked at the house where she'd spent 6 years cleaning, cooking, staying invisible. Someone else lived there now. She could see children's toys scattered in the front yard, hear laughter through an open window. They're just memories. They walked in comfortable silence until they reached the small cemetery on the edge of the neighborhood. Lila stopped in front of 2 weathered headstones. Her parents, buried together beneath a tree that had grown taller since she'd last visited. She knelt, brushing away dried leaves with gentle fingers. "I married someone," she said softly to the stone. "I know you'd have questions. So did I at first." She paused, a small smile tugging at her lips. "But I think you'd like him. He's complicated, dangerous, but he sees me, really sees me, not as a burden or an obligation or a debt to be paid." Taeyeon stood a respectful distance back, giving her space, but his presence was solid, anchoring. "I'm safe," Lila continued. "I'm protected. And for the first time since you've been gone, I'm not just surviving." Her voice thickened. "I'm actually living." She stood, wiping her eyes, and found Taeyeon watching her with an expression she'd learned to recognize. The one that said he understood grief, loss, and the weight of carrying forward when everything behind you had burned down. They left flowers and walked back toward the car waiting at the street corner. "Do you regret it?" Taeyeon asked as they reached the sleek black vehicle that looked painfully out of place in this neighborhood. "The way we started?" Lila considered the question seriously. "I regret that I didn't have a choice at first. That men in suits talked about my future like I was furniture being relocated." She turned to face him fully. "But I don't regret where I ended up. Even though I lied to you for months, you were protecting yourself," she said simply. "And whether you knew it or not, you were protecting me too. You gave me safety when I had nothing. Dignity when the world wanted to reduce me to a transaction." She stepped closer. "You could have treated me like property, like payment, like all those debt collectors said I was." "You were never payment," Taeyeon said firmly. "I know that now." Lila reached for his hand, the same hand that had slid a wedding ring onto her finger in that silent chapel, the same hand that had broken attackers with lethal precision. "You taught me something important." "What's that?" "That power isn't about being the loudest or the most visible. It's about knowing exactly who you are and never apologizing for it." She squeezed his fingers. "You sat in that wheelchair and ran an empire. You let people underestimate you until the exact moment you needed them to understand they'd miscalculated. You were never broken, Taeyeon. You were just waiting." Something shifted in his expression. Pride, maybe, or recognition. "And you?" he asked quietly. "Who are you now? Lila Abayomi?" She smiled, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones. "Someone who refuses to be defined by where she came from, Someone who learned that survival is just the beginning, not the end. She paused. Someone who married a king and decided to become a queen worth standing beside. Taein pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her with the careful strength of someone who knew exactly how much force was needed and how much was too much. "You were always worth it," he said against her hair. "I just needed you to see it too." They stood there for a long moment, two people forged in separate fires who'd found something unexpected in each other. Partnership, trust, the understanding that strength came in forms the world didn't always recognize. When they finally pulled apart, Taein opened the car door for her, not because she couldn't do it herself, but because small gestures of care mattered when everything else was built on calculated strategy. As the car pulled away from the neighborhood that had once defined her entire world, Lila looked back one final time. "No regret, no cham, just closure." She turned forward, toward the life waiting ahead. Beside her, Taein's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining naturally. The man who'd hidden his strength until the moment it mattered most. The king who chose invisibility as his greatest weapon. And Lila finally understood the truth that had been building since that first night in the chapel. She hadn't been sold into marriage. She'd been chosen, not as a weakness to exploit, but as a mirror to reflect what real power looked like: quiet, patient, and absolutely devastating when it finally decided to move. She hadn't married a broken man seeking a nurse. She'd married a king who understood that true strength didn't announce itself. Simply was. And together they were unstoppable.